Galaxy's deadliest creature broke containment, found sleeping on the human's lap. The signal came from a planet that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. High Overseer Verktes watched the monitor line flicker, his secondary mandibles clicking with absolute rhythm against his jaw. The gray console did not show an engine failure, it showed ruin. The primary display for Sector Delta remained cold, its data columns completely flat. Beside the dead display, a small glass indicator remained completely dark. It was a pressure gauge for the subdeck ventilation line. The oil inside the glass was dark, sitting perfectly still instead of bubbling with the exhaust. For 12 minutes, the entire crew across the lower vessel had stopped moving their sorting trays. No orders came down from the command block. The structural plates inside the main corridor did not crack from external force, they liquefied from the inside out. The biological weapons containment net hasn't just suffered a failure, the index signature has dropped off our stellar grid entirely. Verktes tapped the glass casing with one thick claw. The glass did not break. It was supposed to register a 3-digit sequence for every living subject on the ship, but the screen was clean. The ultimate weapon of mass destruction had left its berth, and the internal sensors were blind. The tactical display flashed a single warning before the primary power loop severed. A massive shadow had crossed the security threshold of the lower greenhouse. The door panel had been melted into a smooth puddle of silver slag. The screen froze on a single image of the botanical clearing, then the circuit died. I wish I could tell you it ended there, it didn't. Stay close. Across the third corridor, the silence was different. Jov Sterling sat against an exposed tree root, his uniform jacket unbuttoned to let the damp air hit his collar. The air inside the isolated botanical habitat smelled of recycled compost and the iron bite of the filtering units. His left boot was missing its heel, causing his foot to tilt uncomfortably against the dark soil. He did not look at the security lights. He did not care about the distant sirens. Jov held a brushed alloy flask in his right hand. The metal cylinder was covered in deep scuffs from being dropped down 3 separate service ladders during his prior shift. The loose rubber seal on the cap hummed slightly as the hot steam escaped. If this liquid gets cold before my shift ends, the system wins. He took a short sip of the bitter leaf brew, his throat moving slowly as he swallowed. The Sundercore directory had maintained the ship for 40 stellar cycles, and every cycle had been exactly the same. Field technicians were forbidden from entering containment loops without 3 layers of armored shielding. Every safety directive stated that immediate proximity to an unindexed predator resulted in immediate cell termination. The rules of the vessel were absolute, written in cold titanium records that every cadet had to memorize before they were given a grease gun. Jov didn't care about the records today. He had been assigned to clean the filter lines behind the thick cabbage rows because Officer Thran didn't like the way he stared during the morning roll call. Thran was currently 3 decks up, probably checking his secondary joints for alignment errors while the rest of the crew panicked about a scheduled delay. A soft rustle came from the dense brush behind the native maples. The leaves did not shake from a gust of wind. The movement was heavy, deliberate, and entirely too close to the floor. Jov did not drop his flask. He slowly set it down on a patch of wet moss, ensuring the cap remained unsealed so the steam could escape into the leaves. The air grew remarkably thick within 3 heartbeats. It smelled heavily of ionized copper and cold subdeck plating. A shadow rose behind the lowest branch of the central maple, blocking the pale light from the overhead tube. A 3-meter apex entity stepped into the clearing. Its hide was coated in plates of volcanic glass that seemed to absorb the emergency red flare from the corridor outside. It had 3 joints in its forward limbs, each ending in a claw that had easily peeled through 4 inches of reinforced structural bulkhead in Sector Delta. Its multiple road jaws shifted with a dry, clicking sound that resembled 2 stones being rubbed together in a dark well. Jov looked up from his root. His sleep-deprived brain registered the plates, the teeth, and the lightless intelligence behind the creature's twin optical stalks. "You're a large one," Jov muttered, his voice flat from lack of sleep. "You smell like a burnt processor, buddy." The creature did not strike. It tilted its massive triangular skull sideways, the glass plates along its neck sliding against one another with a high-pitched hiss. It lowered its front torso until its snout was exactly 2 inches from Jov's face. Jov reached into his uniform pocket with his good arm. His fingers closed around the dry remnants of his morning ration, 3 hard pieces of baked grain crust that had gone stale before the first bell. He did not throw them with force. He simply slid them across the dirt toward the creature's front claw. The entity caught the largest piece between 2 razor-tipped digits. It raised the dry bread to its olfactory vent, inhaled the scent of salt and yeast, and then closed its jaws. The crunch was loud, echoing through the silent greenhouse like a breaking branch. Satisfied that the creature wasn't planning to audit his maintenance log, Jav reached out with a bare hand. His fingers were stained with black grease from the filter lines. He did not hesitate as he pressed his palm directly into the coarse ridge right above the subject's primary sensory stalks. The skin there was hot, vibrating with a low frequency that made the grease on his skin feel warm. Jav moved his fingers in a slow, circular motion, scratching the thick skin behind the volcanic plates. "Yeah," Jav murmured, his eyes half closed. "You're just undersnacked, that's your whole problem." The beast let out a deep, rattling sound that vibrated through the soil. It didn't retreat. Instead, it turned its massive body in a tight circle, its heavy spiked tail brushing against a row of tomato plants until the red fruit fell into the dirt. Then, it collapsed sideways. The creature's side hit the ground with a thud that shook the roots beneath Jav's seat. It did not stop there. It slid its armored shoulder directly into the space between Jav's ribs and the tree trunk, pinning his lower torso beneath 3 tons of dark, heat-radiating muscle. Jav winced as a sharp pain shot through his left shoulder joint. The bone was wedged tightly against the wood, his arm trapped beneath a thick fold of the creature's flank. "Great," Jav whispered into the dark hide. "Now you're a blanket." The beast closed its 3 separate eyelids, its deep breathing immediately matching the rhythm of the human's chest. 3 decks above them, the security cameras in Terminal Sector 12 suddenly flared back to life. High Overseer Verktes locked his multi-spectrum optics onto the screen, his primary limbs freezing above the manual override keys. The drone feed from the botanical hold showed the missing hyperlethal subject curled into a tight, defensive loop on the floor. It was not eating the vegetation. It was not preparing a strike vector for the main bridge. It was nesting around a third-class maintenance worker who appeared to be snoring into its neck armor. "The subject has established an absolute proximity lock," Scientist Krell said, her soft feathers flattening against her neck as she wiped her optical lenses with a damp cloth. "If we deploy the security squad now, the kinetic impact will trigger an immediate defensive reflex. The human will be crushed before our first round leaves the barrel." The security officers stood in the corridor outside the greenhouse, their pulse shockers held low as they waited for the mechanical seals on the door to recycle. Jav blinked his eyes open as the artificial sky inside the hold shifted to its morning cycle. His face was covered in small bits of maple bark, and his left arm felt completely dead from the shoulder down to the knuckles. Every time he tried to shift his weight away from the tree, the creature beside him let out a soft, chuffing sound, its heavy claw tightening across his lap like an iron bar. "You're heavy, snuggle muffin," Jav said, his voice cracking from thirst. "That's your new name, deal with it." The creature's tail thumped once against the floor, buried deep in the dirt. The mechanical seals on the botanical entryway recycled with a sharp hiss of pneumatic air, a sound that made the creature's hide stiffen against Jav's ribs. High Overseer Verktes stood behind the primary barrier line, his 4 upper mandibles locked in a rigid line of absolute tactical caution. The pulse shockers carried by his front security detail hummed at a low frequency, their energy cells fully primed for a high-density kinetic release. "The subject's vital metrics have altered," Scientist Krell reported from the secondary monitoring deck, her fingers moving across the scanner array without touching the glass. "It has ceased its aggressive searching pattern. The neural loops are stabilizing, but the proximity to the human remains absolute." Jav did not turn his head toward the door panel. His left shoulder was beginning to throb with a deep, hot ache that signaled a major displacement within the joint casing. The weight of the beast's side felt like a cold block of iron pressed into his ribs, yet his hand remained steady on the coarse forehead ridge. Every time his fingers stopped their rhythmic scratching, the dark glass plates along the creature's neck would rise by half an inch, revealing the pale, heat-venting skin beneath. "Stay where you are, technician," Thran's voice crackled through the local overhead speaker grid, flat and distorted by the habitat's moisture-damp lines. "The rescue detail is preparing a standard field fence to isolate the subject. Do not attempt to alter your physical position." "The fence won't hold it if it gets bored," Jav called back, his teeth clenched against the pain in his upper back. "And right now, it's only staying still because I'm giving it my breakfast. If you start clicking those blasters, we're both going to have a very bad morning." The security officers advanced by 3 slow steps, their heavy boots sinking into the dark compost of the carrot rows. The alpha beast did not rise to its feet, but its central optical stalk slowly rotated toward the center line of the corridor. the pupil-less eye widening until it reflected the red flash of the emergency lamps. A low rattling sound started deep within its chest cavity, a seismic frequency that made the water inside Jov's alloy flask ripple against the metal rim. Vertes watched the biometric overlay shift on his handheld slate. The aggression index for the subject hadn't dropped because it was weak. It had dropped because the creature had found a functional biological anchor. The realization hit the High Overseer with the weight of a hull breach. For 40 cycles, the Sundercore Directory had treated this organism as an engine of pure destruction, a weapon to be managed with high-voltage fields and lead-lined walls. They had designed prisons based on the certainty that the apex entity hated everything that breathed. They were catastrophically wrong. The creature didn't want to destroy the vessel. It had broken through 3 feet of reinforced steel plating simply to locate the only organism on the ship that didn't give off the chemical signature of terror. It had bypassed the command block because it was searching for a nest. The Directory's entire weapons preservation framework was built on a lie that a single tired human with one boot heel was currently dismantling with a handful of stale grain. The tactical AI has reevaluated the perimeter, Krell whispered, her feathers drawing tight against her neck as the data columns verified the neural lock. The subject's defensive reflex is now permanently tied to the technician's life signs. If we fire a single shock round at the creature, its muscles will contract reflexively. The human will be severed in 2 before the energy path can ground. The security team stopped their advance, their weapons wavering as the tactical grid on their visors turned from blue to a flashing amber warning. Jov felt a drop of cold sweat slide down his nose, landing directly on the creature's snout. The beast did not flinch. It let out a long, wet breath that smelled of copper and damp peat, its massive jaws closing to within an inch of Jov's good boot. "You're a stubborn lizard," Jov said softly, his voice dropping below the pickup range of the overhead speakers. "But you've got better manners than the management team." The pain in his left arm was shifting from an ache to a sharp, burning sensation as the ligaments around the humerus began to stretch under the beast's immense weight. He could feel the small, rhythmic twitches of the creature's secondary limbs, each movement pressing his shoulder deeper into the rough bark of the maple root. He needed a medical team, but the 2 officers at the gate were currently staring at the entity with the blank, paralyzed look of people who had just watched a mathematical formula turn into a snake. "High Overseer," Jira's voice broke through from the primary research station on the lower decks, her tone completely stripped of its usual bureaucratic formality. "The diplomatic shuttle from the Sundercore Assembly has just entered our landing window. They have already received the automated containment alert. They aren't coming to help with the isolation, they're coming to remove the human for observation." Vertes clicked his mandibles together twice, his hand tightening around his plasma shocker holster until the chitin on his knuckles creaked. The entry of the diplomatic detail meant the ship's log was no longer internal matter for the Directory. If the Assembly representatives discovered that the galaxy's most dangerous apex predator could be controlled with a peanut butter sandwich and 5 minutes of silence, the entire regional power structure would recalibrate before the next cycle began. "Seal the botanical hold," Vertes commanded, his voice dropping into a register that made the security detail back away from the door panel. "No data transfers are to leave this deck. If the diplomat steps onto this ship, he sees an active containment zone, not a laboratory." Inside the clearing, Jov heard the heavy metal barrier slide shut again, the internal locking pins dropping into place with a definitive thud that cut off the red light from the corridor. The greenhouse was plunged back into the pale, watery green illumination of the overhead tubes. The silence returned, thick and loaded with the smell of turned earth. The beast beside him shifted its massive weight again, its spiked tail drawing a deep groove through the soil as it curled tighter around Jov's lower body. Then, from the dark shadow beneath the tree trunk, the creature reached out with its secondary claw, its razor-tipped digits closing gently around the handle of Jov's scuffed alloy flask. Jov froze, his breath catching in his throat as the iron-hard claw lifted the metal cylinder toward its triangular head. The claw did not crush the cylinder. It held the scuffed alloy flask by the neck, tilting the unsealed cap toward its wide olfactory vent to catch the sharp scent of the bitter leaf brew. Jov Sterling held his breath, his right hand still pressed against the beast's hot forehead ridge as the volcanic plates along its neck clicked in a fast, rhythmic sequence. "Don't drink that, Snuggle Muffin," Jov said, his voice dropping into a raspy whisper that barely cleared the space between them. "It's mostly water and old leaves, and it tastes like grease." The alpha predator chuffed, a heavy puff of warm air that blew the steam from the flask directly into Jov's face. It did not drop the cylinder. It carefully lowered the metal base back into the wet moss, leaving it exactly 2 inches from Jov's bare foot before curling its massive limb back over the human's lap. The pressure contact remained absolute, but the low-frequency vibration in its chest slowed down, settling into a rhythm that matched the steady hum of the greenhouse cooling fans. The pain in Jov's left shoulder flared up again, a sharp, white-hot line that traveled from his collarbone down to his knuckles. He could feel the fluid building inside the joint capsule, the swelling tightening his uniform sleeve until the fabric pressed hard against his skin. Every breath was becoming an argument with his ribs, but he kept his right fingers moving along the coarse ridge, maintaining the precise circular scratching that kept the beast from turning back into an engine of mass destruction. A red indicator light flashed twice on the inner frame of the sealed habitat door, signaling a manual override request from the bridge deck. High Overseer Vertes watched the terminal line from his secondary position behind the reinforced glass barrier, his upper mandibles twitching as the docking sensors reported a hard connection at the main airlock. The Sunder Corps assembly diplomat had bypassed the ship's communication array entirely. He wasn't waiting for a data transfer. His shuttle had locked onto the outer hull with a pressurized hiss that shook the primary framework of the isolation vessel. "The representative is crossing the threshold of Sector 9, Scientist Krell reported, her feathers flattening into a dense gray shield along her spine as she adjusted the scanner slate. "He brings an automated enforcement squad from the Central Directory. They aren't carrying standard pulse weapons. They have heavy plasma cutters designed for structural demolition." Vertes did not look back at the scientist. His hand remained fixed on the manual locking toggle, his mind running through the mathematical probabilities of a multi-deck breach. The arrival of the diplomat changed the stakes from a localized containment failure to an existential threat for the entire crew. If the enforcement squad used plasma cutters on the botanical hold, the thermal bloom would agitate the alpha subject into a permanent rage state. The human would die in the first 3 seconds, and the resulting slaughter would strip the directory of its most valuable asset before the data could be verified. "We have to open the inner hatch before they cut the power line," Krell whispered, her voice cracking as the terminal showed the diplomat's squad advancing through the main corridor. "If the primary life support loop drops, the greenhouse filters will fail. The air inside will become toxic to the technician within 40 minutes. "The technician stays where he is," Vertes snapped, his lower limbs locking into the floor plates. "If the diplomat wants the subject, he can look through the glass. He will not set foot on the soil." Inside the clearing, Jov watched the watery green light from the overhead tubes begin to flicker, a slow dimming that signaled a major power diversion on the upper decks. He reached down with his good right hand, his fingers brushing the cool, scuffed surface of his alloy flask before tightening around the handle. He didn't lift it. He simply held the metal, using the familiar weight to ground his thoughts as the air inside the habitat grew noticeably colder. A sharp metallic chime echoed through the speaker grid, followed by a voice that was entirely too smooth for a ship running on emergency power. "This is Diplomat Gerald," the speaker announced, the words carrying the rigid tonal formality of the Central Sunder Corps Authority. "We are clearing the lower hold under Article 7 of the Preservation Charter. All regional personnel are ordered to vacate the monitoring block immediately." Jov didn't move. He looked down at the alpha beast whose optical stalks were now pointing directly toward the ceiling, the pupil-less glass eyes reflecting the dimming tubes above. "Looks like the big bosses are here, buddy," Jov muttered, his chest tightening as his lungs registered the first slight drop in the air quality. "And they didn't bring any snacks." The beast rose by 2 inches, its massive volcanic plates expanding with a loud click that made the dirt beneath Jov's legs shift sideways. The movement was slow, deliberate, and entirely lacking the erratic panic it had shown in Sector Delta. It wasn't preparing to run. It was establishing a wider perimeter around the human's body, its heavy spiked tail forming a rigid semicircle that blocked the entire path between the maple tree and the primary doorway. Vertes watched the monitor screen as the diplomat squad arrived at the outer barrier line. They did not stop to check the biometric logs. 2 four-limbed enforcement officers stepped forward, their massive carapaces lined with honor banding that caught the red reflection of the sirens. They set a heavy, 3-legged plasma cutter directly against the center seam of the reinforced door. "Hold your fire," Vertes said, his voice dropping into a low register as he stepped into the path of the diplomat's detail. "The subject has integrated its defensive loop with the human technician. If you breach that seal with thermal tools, you clear the room of all living tissue." Diplomat Gerald did not raise his optical stalks. He looked at the console slate in his front limb, his mandibles moving in a slow, casual circle that signaled complete indifference to the regional officer's warning. "The human is an unindexed laborer," the diplomat stated, his tone flat and unbothered by the sirens. "His contract contains a standard structural hazard clause. The preservation of the asset outranks his metabolic continuity." The 3-legged cutter hummed, a high-pitched whine that started at the edge of hearing and immediately set the air inside the monitoring block to vibrating. A small, bright blue point of light appeared at the top of the door seam, spitting white sparks that smelled of ozone and melting iron. Scientist Krell backed away from the console, her feathers completely ruffled as she watched the internal habitat metrics begin to shift into the danger zone. The temperature inside the greenhouse is rising by 2 degrees per minute, she reported, her fingers trembling as she locked the secondary data cache. The human's hydration levels are dropping. If the joint displacement isn't reduced within 15 minutes, the muscle damage will become irreversible. Jav felt the wall behind him grow warm as the plasma torch cut through the outer layers of the bulkhead. He did not pull his arm away from the creature's flank. He reached into his field kit with his right hand, his fingers touching a small, forgotten object at the bottom of the canvas pouch, a heavy iron screwdriver with a cracked plastic handle that he used to clear grease from the pump lines. He didn't pull it out. He just held the plastic grip, his thumb rubbing the rough seam where the factory mold had left a sharp edge. The alpha beast let out a low chuffing sound, its head lowering until its snout was resting directly on top of Jav's scuffed alloy flask. It didn't crush the metal. It simply held it there, its third eyelid closing slowly as the white sparks from the doorway grew brighter, illuminating the dark rows of cabbage leaves with a harsh, artificial light that made the green fruit look black. The blue beam of the plasma cutter sliced through the final internal support pillar, sending a shower of orange sparks across the cabbage rows. The reinforced barrier of the botanical hold gave way with a heavy grinding screech of protesting titanium. Diplomat Gerald stepped through the gap before the smoke could clear, his rigid carapace coated in a thin layer of white ash, his 4 upper mandibles slightly flared in an expression of absolute administrative authority. The automated enforcement squad moved behind him in a perfect line, their 3-legged cutters held low, their heavy boots crushing the small irrigation lines beneath the mud. They did not check the biometric displays. They focused their targeting lenses directly on the clearing under the maple tree where the alpha beast remained motionless. Jav Sterling did not pull his body away from the tree root. He reached down with his right hand, took the cracked plastic handle of his iron screwdriver from his field kit, and quietly scraped a small wedge of dried grease from the pump valve beside his leg. He did not look up at the blasters. He did not point the tool. He just cleaned the iron seam with slow, repetitive motions that kept his heart rate from triggering the creature's secondary defense loops. "The extraction protocol is locked," Gerald announced, his smooth voice cutting through the hiss of the cooling vents. "Move the human laborer to the secondary corridor for decontamination. Secure the asset with the high-voltage net." 2 enforcement officers stepped into the mud, their massive clawed limbs reaching toward Jav's uniform jacket. The alpha beast did not rise to its feet. It simply extended its primary 3-jointed limb across Jav's lap, its volcanic glass plates sliding together with a sound like a sharpening blade. The razor-tipped digits came to rest exactly 1 inch from the leading officer's chest plating. A low, rattling frequency started in its throat, an acoustic warning so dense that the glass indicator casing on the far bulkhead shattered into 3 neat pieces. No warning, no declaration, no mercy. The entire enforcement squad went perfectly still, their visors flashing an immediate amber warning as the tactical AI registered a 97% lethality projection within the sector. "Stand down," Vertes commanded from the broken doorway, his lower limbs locking against the frame to prevent the guards from drawing their sidearms. "The subject has integrated its neural anchor with the technician's pulse. If you pull him out by force, the creature will liquefy this entire deck before your systems can recycle." Diplomat Gerald lowered his optical stalks, his screen showing the human's pulse line running in a perfect, steady 60-beat rhythm alongside the beast's massive heat spikes. The scale of the directory's preservation project had just collapsed into a single named entity on a 3rd-class contract registry. "The worker is suffering from severe joint displacement," Gerald stated, his mandibles clicking with slight irritation as the data verified the lock. "He will suffer total muscular failure within 10 minutes if the bone isn't reset." "Then fix it here," Jav muttered, his forehead resting against the creature's hot hide as the sweat dripped into his eyes. "But tell your boys to turn off the cutters. The smell of hot iron makes him twitch." A medical officer from the Kreshrin detail stepped forward slowly, her soft plumage flat against her neck as she set a portable trauma kit into the mud. She did not use a mechanical bracing rig. Under the unblinking gaze of the beast's twin optical stalks, she slipped a saline injector into Jav's right forearm and carefully took hold of his left wrist. The reduction was fast, a dull, wet pop that echoed through the quiet greenhouse as the humerus slid back into the glenade cavity. Jav didn't scream. He bit into his lower lip until the copper taste of blood cleared his throat, his right fingers immediately resuming their slow, circular scratching along the beast's forehead ridge. The creature chuffed, its third eyelid closing over its lightless pupil as its massive body settled back into the soil, its spiked tail remaining locked in a defensive semicircle around the human's boots. 6 weeks later, the isolation vessel Corvand was no longer listed on the Central Directory Registry. The Sundercore Directory had officially codified the Sterling Protocol, establishing a permanent restriction zone across an isolated terrestrial meadow in the Virginia Hills, far away from the rigid calculations of the assembly stations. The farmland quarantine region looked ordinary from the perimeter fence, its rows of native maples and wild blackberry briars growing over the wire. Jav sat on the low porch of the field office, his left arm supported by a flexible canvas sling that wrapped tightly across his ribs. His scuffed alloy flask sat on the wooden table beside his chair, its brushed metal base completely flattened by a heavy indentation that bore the distinct outline of a three-jointed claw. Dr. Krell stood at the edge of the porch, her clinical slate tucked beneath her wing as she watched the meadow below. The behavioral index has remained at 0 for 40 consecutive days, she reported, her tone stripped of its original academic detachment. But the council has just flagged a new arrival at the orbital hub. It is a Crimson 6 entity from the Sirius sector. It dissolved 3 automated transport frames before they could secure the hatch. Jav didn't answer. He picked up his flattened flask with his good right hand, took a short sip of the cold well water and watched the high grass shift in the evening wind. Down in the pasture, the alpha beast lay in a wide sprawl beneath a maple tree, its volcanic glass plates reflecting the red light of the setting sun. It did not track the clouds. Its central optical stalk remained fixed on the long gray shipping container currently settling into the concrete landing bay at the far corner of the fence line. The crate rattled, a heavy metallic thud from the inside that made the wire mesh vibrate with a low, unresolved tension. Jav set the flask down on the wood. He did not fix the sling. His right hand reached for the iron screwdriver in his pocket, his thumb tracking the rough factory seam as the sirens at the perimeter gate began to hum. The shadow in the tall grass did not move. It waited for the next box to open.